The nurse called me collect because my phone had been taken. She whispered, "Mrs. Palmer, someone told us to stop your physical therapy." I was lying in a nursing home bed with a broken hip, and my daughter-in-law had signed a form to discontinue my treatment. She told the staff I couldn't afford it. What she didn't know was that my late husband had created a $120 million trust, and I was the sole beneficiary. The moment my attorney walked through those nursing home doors, everything changed. Where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. My name is Margaret Palmer, and I am 72 years old. For 48 years, I lived a life that looked ordinary from the outside, but was built on secrets my husband Arthur kept with the precision of a watchmaker. We lived in a colonial house on Willow Creek Drive in a quiet suburb of Cincinnati. It was not a mansion, just a well-kept home with a garden that Arthur tended every Saturday morning without fail. People saw a retired teacher and her husband who worked in logistics. They saw a modest life. They did not see the empire Arthur built in the shadows of the shipping industry. He never spent the money. He never upgraded the car. He never changed the suit he wore to church. Arthur used to say that wealth is not what you show, it is what you keep safe. I thought he was just being frugal. I did not know he was building a fortress around us. The house had 3 bedrooms and a kitchen with yellow tiles that chipped if you dropped a heavy pot. We bought it in 1976, when the interest rates were high and the air smelled like cut grass. I taught 2nd grade at Lincoln Elementary for 35 years. I remember the smell of chalk dust and glue sticks. I remember the faces of children who needed someone to believe in them. Arthur worked for a shipping company called Midland Freight. He started as a clerk and ended as a partner. He never told me the details of the deals. He said some things are safer in the dark. I respected that. I respected his need for privacy. But privacy can become secrecy, and secrecy can become a wall. I never asked about the accounts. I never asked about the investments. I trusted him. That was my first mistake. Not trusting him, but trusting that everyone else was like us. I thought honesty was the default setting for people. I thought family meant protection. I thought love meant safety. I was wrong. The neighborhood where we lived was filled with people who knew each other's business. They knew when we went on vacation. They knew when we bought a new refrigerator. They did not know that Arthur owned shares in the company that delivered the refrigerator. They did not know that the pension I relied on was a fraction of what he actually earned. He saved everything. He invested everything. He compounded everything. When he died, I thought I was left with a modest estate. I thought I was left with memories and a house and a small savings account. I was prepared to downsize. I was prepared to live carefully. I was prepared to be a burden to no one. Arthur used to say, paperwork matters. He said it often enough that it became a joke between us. I would laugh and tell him that life matters more. He would smile and shake his head. He would say that paperwork is how you protect life. I did not understand what he meant until I was lying in that bed with a broken hip and a phone that was not mine. I did not understand that he was protecting me from the people I loved most. He was protecting me from my own son. He was protecting me from the woman my son married. He knew something I did not know. He knew that money changes people. He knew that greed wears a friendly face. He knew that the people who smile at you at the dinner table might be counting the silverware when you turn your back. I learned this slowly. I learned it in pieces. I learned it in the way my daughter-in-law looked at me when she thought I was asleep. I learned it in the way my son avoided my eyes when he talked about money. I learned it in the silence of the house after Arthur died. The silence was not empty. It was full of things unsaid. It was full of plans I was not part of. I should have seen it sooner. I should have asked more questions. But I was grieving, and grief makes you vulnerable. It makes you want to believe the lies because the truth is too heavy to carry. I wanted to believe that David loved me. I wanted to believe that Sarah cared for me. I wanted to believe that family was enough. But family is not always enough. Sometimes family is the danger. Sometimes the threat comes from inside the house. Sometimes the person who brings you soup is the same person who poisoned the broth. I am telling you this so you know what to look for. I am telling you this so you do not make the same mistakes I made. I am telling you this because I survived. And if I survived, you can too. The story starts before the hospital. It starts before the fall. It starts in the quiet moments where nothing seems wrong. That is where the danger hides. It hides in the normalcy. It hides in the routine. It hides in the people you trust the most. Our son David was 45 when Arthur died last November. David was a good boy once, the kind who brought home stray dogs and cried when goldfish died. But somewhere between college and his marriage to Sarah, something hardened in him. Sarah was 38, sharp-eyed, and worked as a financial advisor. She had a way of looking at people that made you feel like an asset on a balance sheet. When Arthur died, David moved into my house within the week. He said it was to help me. He said I was too vulnerable to be alone. I believed him because a mother wants to believe her son. But looking back, I see the signs I ignored. The way Sarah checked the mail before I could touch it. The way David asked about the deed to the house during the funeral reception. That small detail didn't seem important at the time. It would later change everything. David told me he was worried about the upkeep. He said the house was too big for one woman. He said the yard was dangerous in the winter. He said he wanted to be close in case I needed something. It sounded reasonable. It sounded like love. But there was an urgency to it that felt off. He did not ask if I wanted him there. He told me he was moving in. He brought boxes before I had finished packing Arthur's clothes. He took over the garage without asking. He changed the locks on the front door without telling me. He said it was for security. He said there had been break-ins in the neighborhood. I did not check the news to see if there had been break-ins. I just nodded and handed over my key. I felt like a guest in my own home. Sarah organized the kitchen. She threw away spices that were expired. She threw away containers that did not match. She threw away things that had memory. She said she was decluttering. She said clutter causes stress. She said I needed a calm environment. I felt my space shrinking. I felt my presence diminishing. I was being edited out of my own life. David started handling the bills. He said it was too much for me. He said I needed to rest. He said he would take care of everything. I let him. I was tired. I was sad. I did not have the energy to fight. I thought it was temporary. I thought once the grief passed, things would go back to normal. But things did not go back to normal. Things got tighter. Sarah started asking questions about Arthur's accounts. She asked where the statements were. She asked if there were any safe deposit boxes. She asked if Arthur had any private investments. I told her I did not know. I told her Arthur handled everything. She did not believe me. I could see it in her eyes. She thought I was hiding something. She thought I was holding out. She started going through the desk drawers when I was in the garden. I caught her once. She was sitting at Arthur's desk with papers spread out. She looked up and smiled. She said she was looking for insurance policies. She said she wanted to make sure everything was covered. She did not look guilty. She looked entitled. She looked like she owned the place. David started talking about selling the house. He said it was too much maintenance. He said we could get a nice condo for me. He said the equity would help us all. He used the word, us. He included himself in my assets. He included Sarah in my future. I felt a cold knot in my stomach. I said I was not ready to sell. I said this was my home. David nodded, but he did not look happy. He said we would talk about it later. He said I needed to think about the future. He said I needed to be realistic. Realistic meant giving up control. Realistic meant giving up independence. Realistic meant becoming dependent on them. I started sleeping with the deed to the house under my mattress. I started hiding Arthur's old letters in a box. In the closet. I started feeling like a criminal in my own life. I started wondering if Arthur knew this would happen. I started wondering if he left me a way out. I started remembering the things he said. Paperwork matters. Wealth is what you keep safe. Protecting his wife from people who loved her only for what she could give them. I did not know about the trust yet. I did not know about the $120 million. I only knew that I was being crowded. I only knew that I was being managed. I only knew that I was becoming a problem to be solved. Sarah started scheduling appointments for me. She said I needed a checkup. She said I needed a financial review. She said I needed to update my will. I went to the checkup. I went to the review. I did not go to the lawyer. I made an excuse. I said I was not feeling well. I said I needed time. Sarah pressed me. She said it was important. She said David needed to know where things stood. She said we needed to plan for my care. My care. The way she said it made it sound like a burden, like a cost, like something they were doing out of obligation. I felt the distance growing. I felt the love fading. I felt the transaction taking its place. I was no longer a mother. I was an asset. I was no longer a person. I was a liability. And liabilities need to be managed. Liabilities need to be minimized. Liabilities need to be resolved. I started watching them. I started listening to their conversations. I started noticing the glances they exchanged when I entered the room. Something about the way he said those words made my chest tighten. That small glance didn't escape my notice. For a moment, the room felt unusually quiet. I noticed the quick glance they exchanged. It lasted less than a second, but I saw it. They thought I was oblivious. They thought I was distracted by grief. They thought I was too old to understand. But I understood. I understood too well. And suddenly, Arthur's warning echoed in my mind. Paperwork matters. I did not have the paperwork yet, but I was starting to look for it. I was starting to wonder where Arthur kept his secrets. I was starting to wonder if he left me a map. Because what happened next changed everything I believed about my son. And that small, unanswered question is where the truth begins. But David didn't know one critical detail. Neither did Sarah. They thought they were hunting prey. They did not know the prey was protected. They did not know the trap was already set. They just did not know who it was set for. The accident happened 3 weeks after Arthur's burial. I was walking to the mailbox when ice formed on the step, faster than I could react. My hip snapped with a sound like a dry branch breaking in winter. The pain was white and blinding. I woke up in the hospital with David and Sarah standing over me. They looked concerned, but there was something else in their eyes. A calculation. Sarah held my hand and told me not to worry about the bills. She said they would handle everything. I was groggy from medication, but I heard her whisper to David in the hallway. She said we need to get power of attorney before she wakes up fully. I closed my eyes and pretended to sleep. For the first time since Arthur died, I felt something other than grief. Clarity. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and floor wax. The lights were too bright. The nurses spoke in hushed tones. I felt small in the bed. I felt fragile. I felt like something that could be broken again. David came in and sat by the bed. He asked how I was feeling. I said I was in pain. He nodded. He said the doctor said I would need surgery. He said I would need rehabilitation. He said it would be expensive. I asked how expensive. He hesitated. He said it could be tens of thousands of dollars. He said insurance might not cover all of it. He said we might need to use some of my savings. I said I did not have much savings. He said we would see. He said we would figure it out. The way he said we made me feel sick. We. As if my money was our money. As if my body was our problem. Sarah came in with a clipboard. She said I needed to sign some papers. She said it was for the hospital. She said it was standard procedure. I looked at the papers. They were blurry. I could not read the fine print. I asked what they were. She said it was authorization for treatment. She said it was billing information. I picked up the pen. My hand was shaking. I looked at David. He looked at the floor. He did not meet my eyes. I put the pen down. I said I wanted to read them first. Sarah smiled. It was a tight smile. She said there was no time. She said the nurse was waiting. She said I needed to rest. I said I wanted my glasses. She said she would get them. She did not get them. She left the clipboard on the table. She said I could sign it later. She said, do not worry about it. I worried about it. I worried about everything. I worried about the papers. I worried about the power of attorney. I worried about the whisper I heard in the hallway. I worried that I was signing away my life. I worried that I was signing away my freedom. I waited until they left the room. I waited until the nurse came in to check my vitals. I asked the nurse if she knew what papers Sarah left. The nurse looked at the clipboard. She said it was a durable power of attorney for healthcare and finances. She said it was comprehensive. She said it gave them full control. I asked if I had to sign it. The nurse said technically no. She said, but family usually handles it. She said it makes things easier. I said I did not want them to have control. The nurse looked surprised. She said you should think about it. She said you are in no condition to manage things. I said I am still alive. I said I am still competent. The nurse did not argue. She just nodded. She said I should talk to my doctor. She left the room. I lay there and stared at the ceiling. I thought about Arthur. I thought about the secrets. I thought about the paperwork. I realized I needed help. I realized I could not do this alone. I realized I needed someone who knew Arthur. I needed someone who knew the truth. I did not know about the trust yet, but I knew I was in danger. I knew that signature was a key, and once they had the key, they could lock me out. They could lock me out of my money. They could lock me out of my decisions. They could lock me out of my life. I waited for Sarah to come back. I pretended to be asleep. I listened to her talk to David outside the door. She said she is resisting. She said we need to push harder. She said the doctor will support us. She said we can say she is confused. She said it is for her own good. For her own good. The words burned in my ears. They were using love as a weapon. They were using care as a cage. I made a decision then. I decided I would not sign. I decided I would play along until I could get out. I decided I would find Arthur's secret. I decided I would survive. The surgery was successful. The hip was fixed with pins and screws. The pain was manageable with medication. But the real pain was the betrayal. It was the knowledge that my son was trying to take control of me. It was the knowledge that my daughter-in-law saw me as a burden to be managed. It was the knowledge that I was alone in a room full of people. I recovered enough to be moved. They said I needed rehabilitation. They said I needed a facility. Sarah found a place called Oak Creek Care Center. She said it was the best. She said it was affordable. She said it was close to home. I did not argue. I went where they took me. I knew it was a trap, but I knew I could not fight it yet. I needed time. I needed strength. I needed a plan. And I needed a phone call. They transferred me to Oak Creek Care Center 2 days later. It was a clean facility, but the air smelled of antiseptic and resignation. Sarah visited every day, but she never stayed long. She would sit by the bed and talk about how expensive care was. She talked about insurance limits and out-of-pocket costs. She mentioned numbers like $50,000 and $100,000 as if they were inevitable walls I could not climb. I nodded and smiled, playing the part of the confused old woman. But my mind was sharp. Arthur had taught me to listen more than I spoke. He used to say, "Paperwork matters." Those words echoed in my mind every time Sarah mentioned signing a new form. The room was small. It had a window that looked out onto a parking lot. I watched the cars come and go. I watched the families visit. I watched the old people sit in wheelchairs in the hallway. I did not want to be one of them. I did not want to fade away. I did not want to be forgotten. Sarah brought me clothes. She brought me books. She brought me things to keep me occupied. She said she wanted me to be comfortable. But she took my phone. She said it was distracting. She said I needed to rest. She said she would handle the calls. She said she would talk to the friends. She cut me off from the world. She isolated me. She made me dependent on her for information. She made me dependent on her for connection. She made me dependent on her for reality. I felt the walls closing in. I felt the silence growing. I felt the control tightening. Then the therapy stopped. The nurse, a kind woman named Linda, slipped me her cell phone when Sarah wasn't looking. She told me Sarah had signed a directive citing financial hardship. She said the administration believed I had no assets to cover the rehabilitation. Linda looked ashamed when she said it. She said they thought I was indigent. I felt a cold rage settle in my chest. This was not just about money. This was about control. They wanted me weak. They wanted me dependent. If I couldn't walk, I couldn't leave. If I couldn't leave, I couldn't access the bank. And if I couldn't access the bank, they could petition for guardianship. It was a perfect trap. But Sarah had made one mistake. She assumed Arthur spent everything. She assumed I had nothing. She assumed I was powerless. She did not know about the trust. She did not know about the $120 million. She did not know about Robert Chen. Linda told me I needed to make a call. She said she could not keep the phone long. She said Sarah checks the logs. She said I needed to be quick. I took the phone. My hands were shaking. I dialed the number I memorized 40 years ago. It was the direct line to Arthur's attorney, a man named Robert Chen. I had not spoken to Robert in decades, but Arthur made me promise that if anything ever felt wrong, I would use that number. I remembered the number because Arthur made me recite it every year on our anniversary. He said it was important. He said it was insurance. I did not know why. Now I knew. I heard the ring. I heard the voice. I said, Robert, it is Margaret. I said, I need help. I said, I am at Oak Creek. I said they stopped my therapy. I said they say I have no money. I said I know there is a trust. I said I need you to come. Robert said he would be there in the morning. He said do not sign anything. He said do not worry. He said Arthur planned for this. He said Arthur knew. I hung up the phone. I gave it back to Linda. I said thank you. She said be careful. She said Sarah is watching. I said I know. I lay back on the pillow. I closed my eyes. I felt a spark of hope. It was small, but it was there. I was not alone. I had a plan. I had a lawyer. I had the truth. Sarah came in an hour later. She looked at me. She asked if I had called anyone. I said no. I said I was sleeping. She looked at the phone on the table. It was in the same spot. She seemed satisfied. She said good. She said you need to rest. She said we have a big day tomorrow. I asked what was happening. She said we are reviewing the care plan. She said we need to make some adjustments. I knew what that meant. They were going to cut me off. They were going to stop the treatment. They were going to leave me broken. They were going to force me to sign over the house. They were going to take everything. But they did not know. They did not know about Robert. They did not know about the trust. They did not know that the game was over. They thought they were winning. They thought I was losing. They thought I was helpless. But I was waiting. I was watching. I was ready. The night was long. The shadows were deep. But the morning was coming. And with the morning came the truth. Robert Chen arrived the next morning at 8 o'clock. He was older now, his hair grey, but his suit was still impeccable. He did not announce himself. He simply walked into my room while Sarah... Robert opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. He placed it on the bedspread. He told Sarah that my mental capacity had been verified by 3 independent doctors before I ever fell on the ice. He said the evaluation was done 6 months ago, at Arthur's request. Sarah's smile froze. For a moment, the room felt unusually quiet. The hum of the machines seemed to fade. She realized the ground was shifting beneath her feet. Robert began to read from the document. He spoke about the Arthur Palmer Living Trust established in 1985. He mentioned the value of the assets held within. He said the words $120 million clearly. He did not shout. He did not need to. The number hung in the air like a heavy curtain dropping. Sarah took a step back. Her hand gripped the back of the chair so hard her knuckles turned white. She whispered that it was impossible. She said Arthur drove a 10-year-old Ford. She said we lived on a teacher's pension. Robert smiled sadly. He told her that was the point. Arthur believed in silence. He believed in safety. And he believed in protecting his wife from people who loved her only for what she could give them. Sarah tried to recover. She straightened her jacket and tried to smile. She said that was wonderful news for the family. She said now that we knew about the funds, we could properly manage them for Margaret's care. She used the word we, as if she had any claim to it. She looked at David, who had just walked in. David looked confused. He asked what was happening. Sarah told him about the trust. She told him there was $120 million. I saw the change in David's eyes. It was not joy. It was hunger. He looked at me, and for the first time I saw my son as a stranger. He asked if the money was accessible now. He asked if he could be the trustee. Robert closed the folder. He told David that the trust was irrevocable. He said the sole beneficiary was Margaret Palmer, and upon her death, the funds were designated to a charity for literacy programs. He said there was no inheritance for the children. He said Arthur had written a letter explaining why. Robert handed David an envelope. David opened it with shaking hands. He read the letter aloud. Arthur's voice came through the words. He wrote that he loved his son, but he had seen how money changed people. He wrote that he wanted David to stand on his own feet. He wrote that if David ever needed help, he only had to ask, but he could not take. The last line said, "I hope you forgive me for loving you enough to say no." David crumpled the paper in his fist. Sarah laughed. It was a brittle, angry sound. She said this was elder abuse. She said we were being manipulated. She said Margaret was being influenced by this lawyer. She turned to the nurse who was standing in the doorway. She told the nurse to call security. She said these people were scams. Linda did not move. She looked at Sarah and said quietly that she had heard the conversation about stopping treatment. She said she had already filed a report with Adult Protective Services. Sarah's face went pale. She realized the walls were closing in. She looked at David for support, but he was staring at the crumpled letter on the floor. I sat up in the bed. My hip still throbbed, but I felt stronger than I had in months. I looked at Sarah and told her she was right about one thing. I said I could not afford the treatment she wanted me to have. I said I could not afford the cost of losing my son. I told her to leave. I told her not to come back. Sarah stepped forward, her eyes blazing. She said I would regret this. She said I would be alone. She said no one would want an old woman with no family. I looked at Robert. I looked at Linda. I looked at the window where the sun was rising over the parking lot. I told Sarah that I was not alone. I told her I had my dignity. And I told her that was worth more than $120 million. David finally spoke. His voice was small. He asked if I was really cutting him out. He asked if I hated him. I felt a tear slide down my cheek. I did not hate him. I pitied him. I told him I loved him enough to let him go. I told him he needed to find out who he was without my money. I told him he needed to find out who Sarah was without my money. David looked at Sarah. For the first time, he saw her clearly. He saw the calculation in her eyes. He saw the fear. He took a step away from her. It was a small step, but it was a start. Sarah turned on her heel and walked out. She did not look back. The sound of her heels clicking down the hallway faded until it was gone. The silence left behind by Sarah was heavier than the shouting I had feared. It hung in the air of the hospital room like dust motes dancing in a shaft of light. David stood near the window, still holding the crumpled letter from his father. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. The anger that had tightened his shoulders moments before was draining away, replaced by a hollow confusion. He looked at me and asked if I knew about this all along. I told him I knew nothing until the fall. I told him Arthur kept his secrets to keep us safe. David shook his head. He said, safe from what? He said, we are family. I said, family does not stop physical therapy. I said, family does not hide phones. He flinched at that. He looked at the floor and said Sarah told him it was for the best. He said she told him I was spending money recklessly. I felt a sadness so deep it felt like drowning. My son did not know his own mother. He knew only the version Sarah had painted for him. Robert stepped forward and placed a hand on David's arm. He told David that the trust was legal and binding. He said contesting it would cost more than any potential gain. He said the charity designation was ironclad. David nodded slowly. He asked if he could see me again. I told him he could call the office. I told him I needed time. He left without looking back. The door clicked shut. The sound was final. Linda came in with a wheelchair. She said the administration was processing my discharge. She said Robert had arranged for a private transport. I looked at the room where I had lain for 3 weeks. I looked at the bed where I had planned to die. I told Linda I was ready. She helped me into the chair. Her hands were gentle. She whispered that she had made copies of the stop treatment order. She said she mailed them to Adult Protective Services that morning. I thanked her. I told her she saved my life. She said no. She said I saved myself. We moved down the hallway. The lights hummed overhead. The smell of antiseptic faded as we reached the lobby. The air outside was cold and sharp. It smelled like rain and exhaust. I breathed it in. It smelled like freedom. The car was waiting. A black sedan with a driver Robert had hired. I got in. I did not look back at the building. I knew I would never return to Oak Creek Care Center. I knew I would never return to the house on Willow Creek Drive either. That house belonged to the past. It belonged to the woman who trusted too easily. I was someone else now. I was a woman who knew the value of paperwork. I was a woman who knew the cost of silence. We drove through the city. The streets were familiar but distant. I watched people walking on the sidewalks. They looked busy. They looked like they had places to go. I wondered how many of them were hiding secrets. I wondered how many of them were being hunted by their own families. The car turned onto a street near the river. It stopped in front of a brick building. It was not large. It was secure. Robert had leased a unit for me on the 3rd floor. It was furnished. It had a view of the water. It had a door with 2 locks. It had a phone that only I could answer. Robert helped me inside. He set his briefcase on the table. He told me this was a safe house. He said Sarah would not know the address. He said David would not know the address. He said we had time to secure the assets. I sat on the sofa. My hip throbbed. The pain was a reminder that I was alive. I asked Robert what happens next. He said we wait. He said they will make a move. He said greed makes people careless. He said they will make a mistake. I nodded. I looked out the window. The river flowed dark and steady. It did not care about trusts or families or betrayals. It just moved forward. I decided I would do the same. The first week in the condo was quiet. Robert visited every day. He brought papers. He brought reports. He brought the history of Arthur's life that I had never seen. I learned that Arthur owned stock in 3 major shipping lines. I learned that he held patents on logistics software. I learned that the $120 million was conservative. The actual value was closer to $150 million. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the numbers. They were just numbers. They did not feel like money. They felt like weight. Arthur had carried this weight for 40 years. He carried it so I did not have to. He carried it so David would not be crushed by it. I picked up a file labeled Personal Effects. It contained keys. It contained a small notebook. The notebook was leather-bound and worn. I opened it. The handwriting was Arthur's. The entries were dates and amounts, but there were notes in the margins. I read one from 2 years ago. It said, David asked for $5,000. Said it was for car repair. Did not give. Sarah angry. I read another from 6 months ago. It said Sarah asked about trust structure. Deflected. She is digging. I felt a chill. Arthur knew. He knew they were digging. He knew they were waiting. He was holding the line. I turned the page. There was an entry from the week before he died. It said, Met with Chen, updated beneficiary. Confirmed incapacity clause. Sarah will try to claim incompetence. Prepare evidence. I closed the notebook. My hands were shaking. I called Robert. I told him about the notebook. He said this was crucial. He said Sarah would likely file a petition to declare me incompetent. He said she would use the nursing home stay as proof. He said we needed medical evaluations from independent doctors. I said do it. I said get 10 doctors if you have to. I said I will not be silenced. Robert said he would handle it. He said I should rest. I said I could not rest. I said I needed to know everything. He opened another folder. He said there were irregularities in your accounts before the fall. He said small transfers. He said totaling about $200,000. I asked where the money went. He said to a company called Bright Future Consulting. I asked who owned it. He said Sarah Palmer. I felt the air leave the room. She was not just waiting for inheritance. She was stealing from me while I was alive. She was draining me drop by drop. She was testing the waters. She was seeing how much I would tolerate. I realized the fall might not have been an accident. I realized the ice on the step might have been helped. I did not say this to Robert. I did not say this out loud, but the thought sat in my mind like a stone. I looked at the notebook again. I looked at the river outside. I realized the war had started long before I broke my hip. I realized I was already a victim. The question was whether I would remain one. I stood up. My leg held weight. I walked to the window. I watched a boat move down the river. It moved against the current. It worked hard to move forward. I decided I would be the boat. I decided I would not drift. I decided I would fight. David called 3 days later. The phone rang and I let it go to voicemail. He left a message. He said he was worried. He said Sarah was upset. He said she wanted to talk. He said, please, Mum. I listened to the message twice. His voice sounded desperate. It sounded like the boy who cried over goldfish. But I remembered the man who watched them take my phone. I did not call back. I waited. Robert said silence is a tactic. He said it makes them nervous. He said they will come to us. He was right. 2 days later, David appeared at the building. The concierge called up. I said, let him come. I needed to see him. I needed to see his face. He arrived at the door. He looked tired. He had not shaved. He asked if he could come in. I said yes. He sat on the chair opposite me. He looked around the room. He said, this is nice. I said, it is safe. He nodded. He said, Sarah wants to work things out. I said, Sarah wants the money. He looked down. He said, we are in debt, Mum. He said, we borrowed against the house. He said, we invested in a venture that failed. He said, we need liquidity. I asked how much. He said, $3 million. I laughed. It was a dry sound. I said, I do not have $3 million to give. He said, you have $120 million. I said, I have nothing for you. He said, Dad would want us to be taken care of. I said, Dad left you a letter. I said he told you to stand on your own feet. He said, Dad is dead. He said, things are different now. I said, things are exactly the same. I said, you are my son. I said, I love you. I said, I will not fund your failures. He stood up. He paced the room. He said, you are being selfish. He said, you are hoarding it. He said, you will die and it will go to charity. He said, that is wrong. I said, it is my money. I said, it is my choice. He stopped pacing. He looked at me. His eyes were hard. He said, Sarah says you are not well. He said, she says you are confused. I said, Sarah says many things. He said she has doctors who agree. I felt the trap spring. I said, bring them. I said, let them see me. He said it might come to that. He turned to leave. He stopped at the door. He said, do not make this hard, Mum. He said we can do this the easy way or the hard way. I said, there is only one way. I said, the truth. He left. The door closed. I sat in the silence. I realized they were escalating. I realized the legal petition was coming. I realized I needed more than just the trust. I needed proof of their intent. I needed proof of their greed. I needed to catch them in the act. I called Robert. I told him about the debt. I told him about the threat. He said we need to record interactions. He said we need to document everything. I said, how? He said, I will set up a system. I said, do it. I said, I want them to hang themselves. He said, it will be done. I hung up. I looked at the notebook. I opened it to the last page. There was a name written there. A name I did not recognize. Elias Thorne. There was a phone number next to it. There was a note. If things go wrong, call him. He knows where the bodies are buried. I stared at the name. I wondered what Arthur meant. I wondered what bodies. I wondered if Arthur knew something darker than greed. I picked up the phone. I dialed the number. A man answered. He said, Thorne. I said, this is Margaret Palmer. There was a pause. He said, Arthur told me you might call. He said, I am coming to Cincinnati. He said, I have something for you. I asked what. He said, evidence. He said of what Sarah did before. I asked, before what? He said, before the trust. He said, before the marriage. He said, she has done this before. The line went dead. I sat holding the phone. I realized Sarah was not just a financial advisor. I realized she was a predator. I realized this was not the first time. I realized David was not the first victim. I felt a new kind of anger. It was cold and sharp. It was protective. I was not just fighting for myself, I was fighting for every person Sarah had hunted. I looked out the window. The sun was setting. The sky was purple. I waited for the night. I waited for Elias Thorne. I waited for the truth. Elias Thorne arrived 2 days later. He was a small man with grey hair and eyes that missed nothing. He carried a briefcase similar to Robert's but older. He sat at my table. He did not offer pleasantries. He opened the case. He took out a file. He said Sarah's real name is Sarah Jenkins. He said she changed it 10 years ago. He said she was married before. He said her first husband died under strange circumstances. I asked what circumstances. He said financial ruin. He said she had power of attorney. He said he had a heart attack. He said she collected the insurance. He said there was no trust. I felt sick. I looked at the photos in the file. They showed a woman who looked like Sarah but younger. They showed a man who looked tired. They showed a house that looked like mine. Elias said she targets older men. He said she isolates them. He said she drains them. He said David was not the target. He said you were. He said David was the tool. I asked how he knew this. He said Arthur hired me 5 years ago. He said he suspected her. He said he investigated. He said he found the pattern. He said he created the trust to stop her. He said he kept the evidence in case she moved too fast. I asked why he did not tell me. Elias said Arthur wanted to protect you from the knowledge. He said he wanted you to love your son. He said he knew if you knew, you would confront them. He said he knew they would hurt you. I looked at the photos. I saw the pain in the first husband's eyes. I saw the calculation in Sarah's eyes. I realized Arthur had been fighting a war for 5 years. He had been standing between me and a predator. He had been silent to keep me safe. I asked Elias what happens now. He said we release the file. He said we send it to the police. He said we send it to the Bar Association. He said she will lose her license. He said she will go to jail. I nodded. I said, wait. I said I want to hear her say it. I want to hear her plan. Elias said that is risky. I said I do not care. I said I need to know. I said I need to hear it from her mouth. Elias looked at me. He said I can arrange a meeting. He said she thinks she is winning. He said she will talk. I said set it up. He said it will be recorded. I said good. He stood up. He said be careful, Mrs. Palmer. He said she is dangerous. I said so am I. He left. I sat alone. I looked at the file. I looked at the notebook. I looked at the river. I thought about Arthur. I thought about the silence. I thought about the love that kept secrets. I understood now. The secrets were not walls. They were shields. He built them to protect me. I touched the cover of the notebook. I felt the leather. It was warm. I whispered, "Thank you." The room was quiet. The phone rang. It was David. He said we need to talk. He said Sarah has a proposal. I said bring her. I said come to the condo. He said are you sure? I said yes. He said tomorrow. I said tomorrow. I hung up. I looked at the recorder on the table. It was small and black. Elias had left it. I checked the battery. It was full. I placed it in the center of the table. I covered it with a napkin. I waited. The sun went down. The lights came on. I sat in the chair. I watched the door. I knew they were coming. I knew they thought they had won. I knew they did not know about Elias. I knew they did not know about the first husband. I knew they did not know about the recorder. I smiled. It was a small smile. It was the smile Arthur used to wear when he solved a problem. I waited for the knock. I waited for the truth. I waited for the end of the lie. The knock came at 7 o'clock. I opened the door. David and Sarah stood in the hallway. Sarah was smiling. It was the smile of a winner. She walked in without waiting for an invitation. David followed. He looked nervous. He looked at the table. He looked at the napkin. He did not see the recorder. Sarah sat down. She placed a folder on the table. She said, "We have a solution." She said, "We can avoid court." She said, "We can avoid scandal." I sat opposite her. I folded my hands. I said, "Tell me." She said, "You sign over the management of the trust to us." She said, "We get a stipend." She said, "You live in the house." She said, "We take care of you." I said, "The house is sold." She paused. She said, "Then the condo." She said, "The principal remains." She said, "You are too old to manage $120 million. I said, "I am 72. She said, "You are frail." She said, "You had a fall." She said, "You are confused." I said, "Am I?" She said, "Yes." She said, "The doctors agree." She said, "We have reports." I said, "Show me." She slid the folder across the table. I opened it. The reports were signed by doctors I had never met. The dates were from last week. The diagnosis was early onset dementia. I looked at David. I said, "Did you know about this?" He looked at the table. He said Sarah handled it. I said, "Did you know?" He said, "I trusted her." Sarah laughed. She said, "He is weak." She said, "You need strength." She said, "We are the strength." I looked at her. I said, "You did this before." She stopped smiling. She said, "What?" I said, "The first husband." She went pale. She said, "I do not know what you mean." I said his name was Jenkins. She stood up. She said, "This is nonsense." I said, "Elias Thorne knows." She looked at David. She said, "Who is Elias Thorne?" I said, "Arthur's friend." She said Arthur had no friends. I said he had enough. She grabbed the folder. She said, "Sign the papers." She said, "Or we will put you away." She said, "We will prove you are incompetent." She said, "You will never leave a facility again." I looked at the recorder. I looked at her. I said, "You think you are safe?" She said, "I am." I said, "Are you?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Check your phone." She said, "What?" I said, "Check your email." She pulled out her phone. She looked at the screen. Her face changed. It went from anger to fear. She said, "What is this?" I said, "Evidence." I said, "Of the transfers." I said, "Of the forgery." I said, "Of the first husband." She looked at David. She said, "You did this." He said, "No." She said, "You told them." He said, "I did not know." She threw the phone at the wall. It shattered. She said, "You ruined everything." I said, "No." I said, "You did." She stepped toward me, her hand raised. David caught her arm. He said, "Stop." She struggled. She said, "Let go." He said, "No." He looked at me. He said, "Mum, I did not know." I said, "I believe you." She stopped struggling. She looked at us. She said, "You think this is over?" She said, "I have copies." She said, "I have friends in the system." She said, "I will destroy you." I said, "Try." She laughed. It was a manic sound. She said, "You have no idea." She said, "There is something else." I said, "What?" She said, "About Arthur." I said, "Tell me." She said, "No." She said, "You will find out." She said, "Soon." She turned and ran. David stood there. He looked at the broken phone. He looked at me. He said, "I am sorry." I said, "Go." He said, "Mum." I said, "Go." He left. The door closed. I sat alone. I looked at the recorder. I pressed stop. I listened to the playback. Her voice was clear. Her threat was clear. But her last words hung in the air. "There is something else. About Arthur." I felt a cold dread. I realized the trust was not the only secret. I realized Arthur had more. I realized Sarah knew something I did not. I realized the game was not over. I realized the final move was hers. I picked up the phone. I called Elias. I said, "She knows something." He said, "What?" I said, "About Arthur." He said, "Wait." He said, "I'm checking the files." I said, "Hurry." He said, "I will call back." The line went dead. I sat in the dark. The river flowed outside. The lights of the city blinked. I waited for the phone to ring. I waited for the next blow. I waited for the truth about Arthur. And then the phone rang. It was not Elias. It was an unknown number. I answered. A voice said, "Mrs. Palmer." I said yes. The voice said, "Arthur did not die of a heart attack." The line went dead. I held the phone. The room spun. The silence was absolute. I knew then that the real story was just beginning. The phone line went dead, but the voice remained in my ear. Arthur did not die of a heart attack. The words hung in the quiet condo like smoke. I sat in the chair and looked at the recorder on the table. The red light had stopped blinking. The battery was still warm. I felt a coldness spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I thought about the night Arthur died. I thought about the pill bottle on the nightstand. I thought about Sarah visiting him alone the week before. I thought about the way she had insisted on handling his medications. I had trusted her. I had trusted them both. That trust was a weapon they had used against us. My hands stopped shaking. The grief that had weighed me down for months hardened into something else. It became fuel. I picked up the phone and dialed Elias Thorne. He answered on the first ring. I told him about the call. I told him what the voice said. Elias did not speak for a moment. Then he said, "I was afraid of this." He said Arthur had enemies. He said Sarah was not working alone. He said there was a doctor involved. He said the medical examiner's report was altered. I asked if he could prove it. He said he had the original files. He said Arthur had them copied before he died. He said he was bringing them to me. I told him to hurry. I told him to bring Robert Chen. I told him to bring the police. Elias said careful. He said we need to be sure. I said I am sure. I said she threatened me. I said she admitted knowing something. I said bring them. I hung up. I walked to the window. The river was black now. The city lights reflected on the water like broken stars. I thought about Arthur. I thought about the silence he kept. He kept it to protect me, but silence can kill. I realized I had to break the silence. I had to speak the truth, even if it shattered everything. I went to the kitchen. I made a pot of coffee. I set 3 cups on the table. I set the recorder in the center. I covered it with a napkin again. I waited. The clock on the wall ticked. Each second was heavy. I thought about David. I thought about the boy he was. I wondered if he could come back. I wondered if he was too far gone. I hoped he was not. I hoped he could see the light. I hoped he would choose me over her. But I knew I could not save him. He had to save himself. I could only show him the way. I sat down. I smoothed my skirt. I checked my hair in the reflection of the window. I looked like my mother. I looked like a woman who had survived wars. I was ready. The knock came at the door. I did not move immediately. I took a breath. I counted to 3. Then I stood up. I walked to the door. I opened it. David stood there. Sarah stood beside him. She looked composed. She looked like she owned the world. She walked in without waiting. David followed. He looked tired. He looked at the coffee cups. He looked at me. I sat down. I gestured for them to sit. They sat. Sarah smiled. It was a thin smile. She said, "We are here to finish this." I said, "Yes." I said, "We are." I reached for the coffee pot. I poured 3 cups. Steam rose in the air. I pushed one toward each of them. I kept mine. I took a sip. It was hot. It burned my throat. I liked the pain. It felt real. I looked at Sarah. "I said you called me earlier. I said you said there was something else. I said about Arthur." She froze. Her hand hovered over the cup. She said, "I do not know what you mean." I said, "Yes, you do." I said, "You know how he died." She laughed. It was a nervous sound. She said he died of a heart attack. She said the doctor signed the certificate. I said the doctor was paid. She stood up. She said, "That is a lie." I said, "Is it?" I said Elias Thorne has the original report. I said he has the records of the transfers to the doctor. I said he has the records of the medications you changed. She looked at David. He looked at her. He said, "What is she talking about?" Sarah said she is confused. She said she is dying. I said, "Am I?" I said I am very alive. I said you are the one who is dying. I said your life is over. She stepped toward me. She said you cannot prove anything. I said, can I not? I reached under the table. I pressed the button on the recorder. The light turned green. I said, listen. Her voice filled the room. It was clear. It was sharp. She said, I will destroy you. She said, there is something else. She said, about Arthur. The room was silent. The recording stopped. I looked at her. I said, explain. She looked at David. He looked at me. His face was white. He said, is it true? Sarah said no. She said it is edited. She said it is fake. I said Elias is coming. I said Robert is coming. I said the police are coming. She grabbed her purse. She said I am leaving. David stood up. He blocked her path. He said wait. She said move. He said no. He said tell me the truth. She said you are weak. She said you are just like your mother. She tried to push past him. He caught her arm. He said, did you hurt him? She said he was old. She said he was going to die anyway. She said I just helped it along. The words hung in the air. They were heavier than the trust. They were heavier than the money. David let go of her arm. He stepped back. He looked like he was going to be sick. He said you killed him. She said, I saved us time. She said money does not wait. She said we needed it. I felt a tear slide down my cheek. It was not for me. It was for Arthur. It was for the life she stole. I said, you are finished. She said, am I? She said, you have nothing. She said, I have friends. She said, I have leverage. I said, no. I said, you have nothing. The doorbell rang. It was a loud sound. It echoed in the room. Sarah looked at the door. She looked at me. She said, do not open it. I stood up. I walked to the door. I opened it. Robert Chen stood there. 2 police officers stood behind him. Elias Thorne stood beside them. They walked in. They filled the room. Robert held a folder. The officers held handcuffs. Sarah backed away. She hit the wall. She said, you cannot do this. Robert said, we can. He said, we have the warrant. He said, we have the evidence. He said, you are under arrest for fraud and manslaughter. The officers stepped forward. Sarah screamed. It was a raw sound. It sounded like an animal caught in a trap. They took her arms. They read her rights. She struggled. She looked at David. She said, help me. David did not move. He stood by the table. He looked at the coffee cup. He looked at me. The officers led her out. The door closed. The silence returned. But it was different now. It was clean. Robert handed me the folder. He said, it is over. He said, you are safe. I said, is it over? He said, yes. He said she will go to prison. He said David is not charged. He said he was an accomplice, but he did not know. He said he needs to cooperate. I looked at David. He was crying. He said, Mum, I am sorry. I said, I know. He said, I did not know. I said, I believe you. He said, what happens now? I said, you go home. I said, you fix what you can. I said, you stay away from me. He nodded. He turned to leave. He stopped at the door. said, "Will I see you again?" I said, "I do not know." He left. The door closed. I was alone with Robert and Elias. I sat down. I picked up the coffee cup. It was cold. I drank it anyway. I looked at the recorder. I pressed stop. I said, "Thank you." Robert said, "You did good." He said Arthur would be proud. I said, "I hope so." They left. I locked the door. I leaned against it. I slid down to the floor. I cried. I cried for Arthur. I cried for the years lost. I cried for the son I lost. I cried until I had no tears left. Then I stood up. I washed my face. I looked in the mirror. I saw Margaret. I saw the survivor. I saw the woman who won. I went to bed. I slept without dreams. I slept without fear. For the first time in a year, I slept in peace. The weeks that followed were quiet. The news carried the story briefly. A financial advisor arrested for fraud. A doctor stripped of his license. A trust protected. The names were not always printed. Privacy was one thing Arthur had secured well. I stayed in the condo by the river. The view changed with the seasons. The leaves turned brown and fell. The snow came and covered the water. I watched it from the window. I drank my coffee. I read my books. Elena came to help me. She was kind. She did not ask for money. She asked for fairness. I paid her well. I paid her more than well. I told her she was family. She smiled. She said she was honored. We cooked together. We talked about her children. We talked about my past. I told her about Arthur. I told her about the trust. I told her about the paperwork. She said he was a wise man. I said he was. I said he was careful. I said he was right. David called me once a month. He did not ask for anything. He told me about his job. He worked at a warehouse. He packed boxes. He said it was hard work. He said he liked it. He said he was paying his rent. He said he was dating a woman named Claire. He said she was nice. He said she did not know about the money. I said good. I said keep it that way. He said, "I miss you, Mum." I said, "I miss you too." We did not meet. Not yet. The wound was too fresh. The betrayal was too deep. But the line was open. That was enough for now. I thought about Sarah often. I heard she was in prison. I heard she was fighting appeals. I heard she had no friends there. I felt no joy in her pain. I felt only relief. She was gone. The threat was gone. The house on Willow Creek Drive was sold. The money went to the charity Arthur had chosen. I kept the condo. I kept the notebook. I kept the recorder. They were my reminders. They were my proof. I went to the cemetery every week. I brought flowers. I sat on the bench near his grave. I talked to him. I told him about the arrest. I told him about David. I told him about the peace. I imagined he was listening. I imagined he was smiling. I imagined he was saying, "I told you so." Arthur used to say paperwork matters. I used to think he meant forms and signatures. I used to think he meant laws and rules. Now I knew what he meant. He meant truth. He meant protection. He meant the record of who you are and what you deserve. He meant that without proof, love is just a word. He meant that without boundaries, family is just a risk. He meant that you must write your own story before someone else writes it for you. I understood now. The trust was not just money. It was a voice. It was a way to speak from beyond the grave. It was a way to say no when I could not say it myself. It was a shield. It was a sword. It was love made tangible. I looked at the headstone. The stone was cold. The name was carved deep. Arthur Palmer, beloved husband. I touched the letters. They were rough under my fingers. I said, "Thank you." The wind moved through the trees. It sounded like a whisper. It sounded like him. I stood up. My hip did not hurt as much. My leg was strong. I walked back to the car. I drove home. I parked in the spot near the door. I walked inside. I locked the door. I sat at the table. I opened the notebook. I wrote a new entry. I wrote the date. I wrote the time. I wrote, "I am free." I closed the book. I put it in the drawer. I turned off the light. The room was dark, but I was not afraid. I knew who I was. I knew what I was worth. I knew that no one could take that from me. Not my son, not his wife, not anyone. I had lost much. I had lost years. I had lost trust. But I had found myself. And that was the greatest inheritance of all. The money would go to charity. The house would go to strangers. But the story was mine. The survival was mine. The dignity was mine. I sat in the quiet. I listened to the river. It flowed on. It did not stop. It did not look back. It moved toward the sea. I was like the river. I was moving forward. I was alive. I was Margaret Palmer. And I was enough. There is a lesson in all of this for those who are listening. Do not let anyone make you feel small. Do not let anyone convince you that you are a burden. You are not a line item on a balance sheet. You are a life with history and value. If you suspect someone is trying to control your finances, trust your gut. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Ask questions, demand answers, and remember that your worth is not defined by what you can give to others. It is defined by who you are when you have nothing left to give. Arthur used to say paperwork matters, but people matter more. Protect your people, protect your peace, and never let anyone steal your voice. I still visit Arthur's grave every week. I bring him flowers. I tell him about the condo. I tell him about Elena. I tell him that David is working hard. I tell him that I am okay. Sometimes I imagine he answers. I imagine he says he knew I would be. He knew I was strong. He knew I would win. The wind moves through the trees and sounds like his voice. It whispers that I did good. It whispers that I am free. And for the first time in a long time, I believe it. The hidden trust saved my life, but the truth saved my soul. That is the only inheritance that matters. That is the only thing that lasts. So I ask you again, where are you watching from? What time is it in your world? Are you sitting in a kitchen like I was? Are you lying in a bed like I was? Know that you are not alone. There are people who care. There are people who will listen. There are people who will fight for you if you let them. Do not stay silent. Do not stay still. Stand up, speak out, and take back your life. The story ends here, but yours is just beginning. Make it count. Make it yours. If this story touched you, tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. Like the video and subscribe. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you for letting me share this pain. Now go and live. Go and be free.